How you doing, folks? You're watching Onward with Onrie Live, and I'm your host, Onrie Compen. Let me just adjust the screen real quick. How y'all doing today? I got a very, very special guest in the house right now. This is the man who has mentored me for a very long time, helped me out when I was first getting started in comics, and really helped make YI SOON SHIN what it is today. Through guidance. Before, I was planning on making it a 60-issue limited series, and he knocked me back down to size and told me that I needed to really condense it and make it something that gets to the root of the stuff. But Mort has been working as a writer for a very long time. He has had numerous stuff published across the board. He has been there. He has done it all, and now he is seeing his work being adapted to film. He is all over the place, and it is my tremendous honor to bring him onto the show. Mort, welcome. We got a little picture of you here. Hold on a second. This is the first time we're going to try this. There we go. Mort Castle, welcome to the show.
And thanks, and it's great to be here.
Absolutely. So, Mort, for those of us who don't know who you are, and shame on you if you don't know who Mort Castle is, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm a guy who writes. I'm a guy who teaches. I'm a guy who sometimes plays harmonica, and that really sums it up real well right there.
So, aside from doing all this, you are also teaching, and you teach at Columbia College Chicago, but you also teach in your local high school. You teach writing, right?
Yeah, up until 2017, I was a writer in residence at 2 high schools and worked with a lot of young writers who have since gone on to be not so young writers, but well-published and award-winning writers. Yeah, I love high school. High school is a great age.
So as somebody who writes, there's this whole kind of a thing of like those who can't do, they teach instead of doing it. But you have obviously proven that saying is completely false, because not only are you passing on knowledge, but you're also out there generating new content, getting deals made, constantly putting yourself out there. How did you find, how long did it take you to strike this balance, to find, this middle ground?
Oh, that's a great question, because I'm not so sure that I've yet found the balance. There are times when I feel if I'm busy writing something for me, I'm neglecting people I ought to be teaching. If I'm busy teaching, I'm neglecting the business end of the business and not on the phone with a film producer. So it's 24 hours in a day, and lo and behold, after you hit like your 40s, I've discovered the 24 hours in a day do require you to spend some of them sleeping.
But of course,
up until you're 35, Onrie, you sleep once a weekend, and like once a month will do it. After that, you start to drag a little.
But of course, that can't be applied to you, because aside from doing all of this, as we see in this photo here of you, you're also playing the harmonica. You are a musician on top of everything, and that is a very big part of your life.
It's true. Well. It's true. I mean, had the career taken off with music, then I'd have pursued that with the same vigor I've gone after the writing. But the writing was first to really start hitting, and so I focused on that. But yeah, guitar, banjo, and even when I'm sitting and writing today, you'll never find me more than an arm's length away from either a piano keyboard or a guitar or a banjo or something. A funny story, some years ago, I published a story called Buckeye Jim in Egypt, and it's about Southern Illinois folk tales. And somebody read that and said, when you wrote this section, you were playing a lot of mandolin, weren't you? And I said, how did you know that? He said, read it out loud. We hear the eighth notes there. And he was right on target.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So now I got a question for you, because I don't think I've ever asked you this before. How did you get into writing, and how did that love for writing turn into a career that got you into comics? Because you've had stuff published by DC. You're working on a celebrated series with about Ray Bradbury, or based on Ray Bradbury, that's published through IDW. You know, how did this all come about? Where did it all begin?
Third grade. And that's no joke, because I discovered in third grade, we're going back a ways here, but the teacher was extremely audio-visual minded. And so Mrs. Curlin brought in the latest audio-visual invention. It was a thing called the phonograph. It had a sound reproducing ability coming from a disc-like object, about 10 inches across, that went around and around. And on this disc-like object, we had 2 Edgar Allan Poe short stories read aloud by, I believe, Mark Miller. And one was The Telltale Heart. The other was not the Mask of the other was... what do you call it? The Telltale Heart and Pit and the Pendulum. That was it. Pit and the Pendulum and the Telltale Heart. Now, these are pretty gruesome stories to share with third graders, but we didn't worry about that so much back then, okay? And I loved them. And I loved putting words on the page in the hopes that I could get that kind of response from others that came from me when I first heard the ending of Pit and the Pendulum. At last, the Inquisition was in the hands of its enemies. Or The Telltale Heart, dissemble no more, I'm guilty, I killed the old man. I had the power of it there. I had no clue that anybody actually living wrote things and got them published until I got to college, where I met a poet by the name of Bill Wantling, and I saw him working at his poetry, and Bill had already had like 7 books of poetry published. And then a friend of mine was writing bad, and I'm saying bad because we both know it, bad mystery detective stuff, and selling it to a mediocre publisher. And he said, hey, I'll bet you could do this. And I said, yeah, I'll bet I could. And so on a manual typewriter, I pounded out my first novel and sold it for a $300 advance.
That's incredible. And then just the rest.
There's no looking back after that. Once you get published the first time, it is an addiction to which you build up no tolerance. The first time is great. The second time is terrific. The fourth time is fine. The 500th time, man, that feels good. Oh yeah, that's good.
And you know, I always look to you as an inspiration, even though when you taught at Columbia College Chicago, where I graduated from, and mentored me after the fact that I graduated from there, in exchange for me taking you out to lunch every once in a while, which is a pleasure that I love doing. Oh,
that seems a million years ago, doesn't it?
Yes, it has been. But the thing is that while I was at Columbia, everybody, your name was, whispered throughout the entire, department, the fiction writing department, of, you got to take a class with Mort Castle. You have to learn from Mort Castle. And I never thought about why, because, I had to fill out my requirements and I had my path and everything like that until you started teaching comic book writing, which happened on my last semester of college. So I didn't get a chance to actually take a class with you. But one of the reasons why your name was so well spoken of is because, unlike a lot of people who say, okay, I want to get into writing, I want to do this for a living, and they don't actually, what are the steps to do it? It's just like, take a class with Mort Castle and you'll find out exactly what those steps are. Because it's like, what do? You go and you write and you improve and you keep growing from there. Who did that for you? Who was your editor? What made you?
I was so very fortunate. There have always been people who have been that kind of encouraging. And of course, on the home front, you expect your parents to, and they were. But then at a particular stage in my life, when I was ready to start taking myself seriously as a possible artist, I ran into a number of people who were artists and said, you're not deluding yourself. If you work hard at this thing, you might make it. One of them was the great poet Lucian Strike. who said, yeah, I know you're writing adventure and fun stories, but these things rise above them sometimes, and you ought to consider it. And the other one was the musician. He's not anywhere near as well known today as he should be. The guy was Josh White, brilliant guitar player. He made a number of motion pictures. He was the first black star set to do the crossover, but it didn't happen. And so he remained pretty much a blues singer. But here he was an invited guest at the White House. One of his great friends was Eleanor Roosevelt. And one day I asked him, we were sharing a bill at a coffee house called It's Here in Chicago. And I said, could you show me how to do that thing on the guitar? Today it's called bending the strings. He called it choking them. And he said, sure. And he taught me a bunch of things over the week that he was playing there and over the week that we were part of the open stage. And it's, yeah, keep at it. You might get somewhere. And so I kept at it. And lo and behold, now some 50 years later, I'm starting to think I'm getting somewhere. Another 20, 30 years, I've got this knock. No kidding.
And it, you know, it's true. And I feel like your philosophy, it really, it holds up, because I'm seeing it in my own experiences. I remember in 2014, when I got dealt some pretty serious blows, you had invited me to come speak to your class, and we went out for lunch afterwards. And, you know, I told you I was like down in the dumps, and you were like, you know what? That'll all change in a very short period of time. Just keep sticking to what you're doing. And I'm really glad I listened to you, as I always have, because that was just my instinct, was to listen to the guy that everybody in the department was hailing. Why would I question it? Especially if you were telling me that this is how you build your career. And sure enough, you know, a couple of years went by, and I figured out how to actually make this profitable and how to pay myself and how to do all this. So yeah, the longer you do things, the more tricks you learn, and the more experience you get. And it helps, you know, forge you into something greater.
That is it. It's a matter more of persistence than any other factor. Talent, a lot of people got talent. Ambition, a lot of people start off with ambition and get knocked a few times and say, well, so much for that ambition. Let's see, I think maybe my brother-in-law can get me into the electricians union.
Right. It's always, because it is a dangerous field. You know, it's like there's no health insurance unless you got like the kind of gig that provides for that. If you worked at CrossGen Comics in the 90s, I think it was the 90s or early 2000s where they
90s.
Yeah, 90s. They were given health care to all their staff members, and you know, that's amazing. But otherwise, you're solely dependent on yourself to make a living. And
it's always been rough for people in the arts unless they came into the arts with an independent source of income. And there were a few way back when, and of course that was the standard for when the arts were reserved for only the highest levels of society. But those days are gone, and they've been gone a long time. And what you do is what you have to do, and you take care of business and you take care of your art, and they're one and the same.
Well, here's a question for you. We just mentioned the electricians union, and now we're talking about writing. So there's two ways of going about things. It's the safe route versus the dangerous route. But even when you're doing what you love, there's aspects of what you do that you hate. Like, for example, you might have to take on a job you don't necessarily want to take on in order to get another job that could open up the door for you into a completely new opportunity. How often throughout your career did you find yourself having to make those kinds of decisions?
For a long time, I was a freelancer in every sense of the word, meaning you need writing done, I will get writing done. Meaning, did I do catalog copy for self-help aids for the handicapped? You bet I did. Did I pick up some things along the way doing that? Yeah, like how to use a camera for advertising purposes. Did I write a national advertising campaign for the swine confinement flooring industry? You bet I did. In my first visit to a hog farm, I went out there in a three-piece suit, and a guy hands me a 45-pound baby oinker and says, cute, ain't he? And he was, and I began learning pigs. And if you were a writer, Peter David came up with a great line, and I don't hesitate to steal it from him. What kind of writer are you? I'm a writer of stuff. Meaning that if you want me to write something and it's not pornographic and it's not slanderous, chances are I'll be glad to write it for you.
Well, you know, digging into that even more, one of the things I've been learning over the course of this pandemic is, you know, I've taken on jobs editing different projects, and I've learned a tremendous amount of different things that I didn't even know that I was capable of, because of the fact that I finally kind of ventured outside of what I was doing with YI SOON SHIN, which is still a very important aspect of what I do, what my career is and what my goals are. But I think venturing out, sometimes going into areas that like you wouldn't expect to go, like what you were saying, you know, writing catalogs and things like that, you pick up skills that help you with everything else you're doing. Now, you primarily have made a real big imprint as a horror writer. Do you channel a lot of your personal experiences into your writing for when it comes to horror?
My best writing, whether it's horror or otherwise, has some degree of autobiography in it. The thing is, you get a shooting license when you put the word fiction as your category, okay? And that means that, this is a story about a kid who drowned. Did you know any kids who drowned? Well, maybe that's for me to know and for you to guess at.
Yeah. How often do you scare yourself while writing, or find yourself in situations where, man, in order for me to get, like, what is the proper writing frame of mind for something like you're really passionate about, like that horror project?
Yeah, the stuff that works best as fright material really frightens me. The stuff that has an impact in terms of, oh my, isn't that sad? It's because I have first found it isn't that sad. And I mean, I can trace certain stories. I originally started off writing about Marilyn Monroe because I had a comic book do me a 26-page script, Marilyn Monroe's biography. I asked the important question, can you pay me? The answer was yes. I said, sure, I'll write it. And I started researching the thing. And by the time I got done understanding her life, I knew I had to write about her in a more serious way, and in a more serious way because she had affected me emotionally. I mean, people talk about her killing herself at age 36, and I discovered reading about her, learning about her, that here was somebody who must have been one heck of a survivor to make it to 36, because her life was hell. And so I wrote a couple stories that give her maybe a little bit of a better life.
What was, I mean, I remember Marilyn Monroe, you know, that was when I was growing up, at least. It wasn't very common that you saw people committing suicide in general, or at least being reported about, let alone celebrities, because back then it was just a different time. But she had this, her career was only kind of just starting. I mean, at 36, you still got, you know, 2/3 of your life ahead of you, depending on how long you want to live, you know, and it was just so sudden. And I remember even me being a kid, I wasn't around when she died. I wasn't born then, but I remember seeing a documentary about it. And there was all this controversy around it too, whether it was suicide or if she was murdered. What was your takeaway? Do you believe that she committed suicide? Do you think that there's any conspiratorial?
She did, but it was probably accidental. In other words, she didn't know how much drug she had in her.
Yeah, which happens more often than people think, you know, especially when we get depressed. And what made her life so difficult?
Crazy mother, crazy grandmother, never sure who her father was, lifetime search for a daddy image, terrible anxiety, terrible insecurity. Every time she went in front of the camera, she was the literal nervous wreck, had to be drugged out of her head half the time to get out there. Just a whole bunch of, here's the poor little girl who grows up and all of a sudden stays the poor little girl inside, like we all do. We all carry parts of our young self with us all the time.
And when you're in the spotlight like that, it's such a fading thing in a lot of ways, because like it never lasts long. You never feel the way you want to feel when you're in the spotlight, and the feelings are very fleeting. I mean, the pressure that's there, what happens once you get off, and everything that goes on. So when you tackled her story, what did you do? What did you change in order to kind of like make it give her the kind of outcome that you kind of wanted her to have?
In one of the stories, and I have two major Marilyn stories in addition to the comic book, and I'm working on a third long one right now. But in those two, she ends her life, but there is no question that she has achieved immortality.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not so bad. I mean,
No.
If your body is gone, but your work stays behind, your thoughts, your imaginations, your creations, hey, 4 out of 5 isn't too bad for immortality.
Absolutely. And our work does transcend us. Like it will survive us forever. And I think that there's something to be said about that, rather than having it all at once, that constant pursuit, like what you were saying when you first came on, that, you get it done once and it gets exciting, but you do it 10 times and it's like, cool, I got the hang of this. You do it by the 500th time and it's like, you still get that same rush. And I think
that's right. As long as you're keeping it fresh, as long as you're not just, well, as I told a student in the past couple of weeks, I don't want to be writing the same story at age 73 as I was at age 25, only this time I get to put in cell phones and people are watching cable.
Yeah. Things are constantly changing, and you're also graduating to, not even graduating, you're moving on to greater levels right now.
That's it. It's always an advancing goal. If you're sitting at one place too long, all of a sudden you're bored with it. All of a sudden you're like the guy I once knew a writer who had written and published, ready for this, 630 novels.
Holy shit.
Yeah, exactly. And his line to me was, how would you like to have on your tombstone? He wrote 630 novels, not a one of which a person could remember reading after he turned the last page.
Sort of like The Rock. That guy's in like every single movie, but like no one ever watches them. So it's like, how is he like, how is he the highest paid actor? I mean, and he's also on every movie that you haven't seen, and he's in a lot of movies. And, I mean, I've seen some movies, but, certainly not all of them. But, when you're that prolific.
The ticket is, if you're grinding it out like sausage, don't be terribly surprised if it stays sausage. Sometimes it's pretty good sausage, but it's the same old sausage. And you liked sausage Monday, you liked sausage Tuesday, you liked sausage Wednesday. It's Thursday. How come you don't like sausage anymore?
Yeah. And has that been your approach to it? Are you more of like, I don't want to because that's how you struck me. That's what attracted me to want to work for you, is you saw what I was doing with YI SOON SHIN and you said, this isn't sausage. This is filet mignon. Treat it like that. Is that
yes, sir? Exactly that.
And that's
exactly that. You've got to be bringing something new to the table every time. Stephen King could repeat himself endlessly and it would still be bestseller, but to his great credit, he doesn't. Here's something new. I haven't tried this before. Oh, here's an area I'm going into. Here's a writing technique I don't think I've ever used for an extended period of time over a full novel. I'm going to.
Yeah.
He's not just the put it in here and it comes out there and you call it sausage guy.
Right. And that's what I think is really cool, is when you can get to a point when you can transcend whatever kind of subcategory someone throws you into. Like I remember I was at Comic-Con one year in San Diego, and one of my contacts out there was telling me, well, you're not suited to write superhero comics. And I thought to myself, really? I mean, I don't know why anybody would think that. oh, well, maybe it's because I haven't actually written a superhero comic yet. But if I did write a superhero comic, you bet your ass I'd write it to the best of my ability. I would try and come at it at a different angle and try and bring something to it that is personal, right?
That's exactly it. That's your stamp to make it unique. And in terms of, I hear so many young people foolishly, they're 18 to 23, 24, and they're saying, I don't want to be pigeonholed. Well, if you're pigeonholed, it's because you've put yourself in that pigeonhole, not because anybody else has. Instead of saying yes to new opportunities, it's, no, I'm safe here. I'll keep doing the same old thing.
Okay, so superheroes. I didn't want to get away from that. You wrote Batman. Now, they don't just let anybody write Batman. Not anybody gets to write Batman. You have to have that exact philosophy you just told me about, where you're not allowing yourself to get pigeonholed. You were opening doors. Tell us how that happened.
Yeah.
And tell us what the experience was like too. I'm fascinated to hear it.
I did it's an all prose Batman, 10,000 word novella. That was for Marty Greenberg. And the reason, this is important too, I preach to students, networking is very much a part of every business within the big communications umbrella, okay? And my network was I knew Marty Greenberg, I knew his pal Bob Weinberg. I said, hey, I'd really like to be in one of the upcoming Batman anthologies. Marty Greenberg said, why not? You've got credits, do it. And so it was not harder than that. However, it was a good 10, 15 years to get to a point where I felt free to approach Marty Greenberg with, I've got credits, I like the character, I'd like to write a story. So he said yes to that. And then, as you said, my own stamp was, I wanted to incorporate some Zen philosophy. And so I was able to get permission to do the Zen poems of Takahashi Ikemoto as translated by Lucian Strike and incorporate them in my Gotham City suite, or Gotham City Spring, a suite of stories, and approached it very much as a philosophical East meets West kind of story, incorporating a lot of the jazz motifs that I was really heavy into at the time and actually still am. Now, here's the sad part, though. We were able to write stories up to 12,000 words, okay? That was part of the requirement. And I had a 12,000 word story, and then I took a look and I said, nah, there's padding here. And so I sliced 2,100 words, making it the length it should have been, but I was going to get paid 10 cents a word. However, it's a successful story. It's been translated into a number of different languages. I'm really happy with it. And people ask, have you written anything that I might have heard of? I say, yeah, you heard of Batman? I wrote that.
Now, here's a question to kind of segue that. Would you ever like to see your novella adapted to a one-shot graphic novel? And has that ever been on the table?
It's not been on the table because it's the Batman that doesn't exist now. This was the Batman of Batman Year One.
Okay. But again, here's the thing about Batman, and let's just look at everybody's take on Batman. Like, for example, Tom King. Tom has gone on record on numerous occasions saying that he writes what he knows, and his take on Batman was a personal one. I don't believe that any other writer who has written Batman over the years hasn't brought some part of themselves into that character.
That's right. If it's been good, there's a chunk of autobiography in it, guaranteed. And
to say that this is a character, I think that the approach of writing superheroes is not simply how do I redefine the character? How do I identify with the character in a way that audiences around the world can do it? How can I play in that? What would I do if I was playing in that sandbox?
Right. Exactly that. Exactly that. And this all comes from self, all comes from the unique person you are. If you're busy not imitating, if you're busy being true to what your head and your experiences and your wildest imaginings are coming up with, you're going to be original. You can't help it. If However, you turn on your classic television station and say, I've got an idea for a show. We'll call it Four's Company. How about that? Or, hey, here, this will be good. We'll have some cute kids and a cute adult, and we'll call it The House That Is Full.
Exactly. You have to find a way to sell it. Otherwise, it's just not going to go. And that brings me to another point.
Sure.
I remember when in 2001, I got a reprint of this Spider-Man arc called Torment. It was the one that Todd McFarlane wrote and drew. Mm-hmm. And the beginning of the book was a foreword that was written by my good friend Jim Salicrup, who edited that entire arc. And in there, he had mentioned, and I think Todd actually was not, the foreword was not written by Jim, it was written by Todd. And what Todd said was, when he was when he was doing this story, it's not like he could just come in and say, this is how Spider-Man is going to be. He had to work within the set guidelines. It's not like he necessarily got to choose what he wanted to do. He was normally told what he had to do. So when he worked on this Torment storyline, he was given, free reign on that, because he had already established himself as being this, rock star comic book artist and / writer. Now, in your case, when you were writing your Batman story, how much leeway were you given? And did you get to pick your villains? Is there a reason why you picked the villain that you did? Did you create your own villain? Like, what was your take on that?
My parameters, I had to write about Batman. It had to involve Catwoman. Outside of that, it had to pass muster with the licensing department at DC. And a couple of interesting things. There was a debate over whether or not smoking was allowed in my story. And eventually it was, we'll let it go as long as it isn't Batman who smokes. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. And then the other one that was really, here we go. I had Batman saying, God damn it. And that was cut. Now, outside of that, we knew for sure you're not going to write a story in which Batman gets killed. I'm not going to go into the story of another writer who decided Batman was heavy into cross-dressing. It didn't get in the book. Right.
And the interesting thing is that it's not that Batman's death can't be tackled. It just has to be approved. And when you're trying to do like a standalone story like what you're doing, there are certain things that you have to be flexible with. Now, I know that there are some creators out there who feel like robbed when certain details like that are stripped from their story. Like, for example, if you had some emotional reason for him saying, God damn it, it could only be God damn it. That's the only line he could possibly say when, he sees his parents dying in front of him for the 300th time. It's whatever the case is, there are certain points where it's like, you have to know where to draw the line, right? I mean, and understand that it's like, okay, I'm playing in somebody else's sandbox.
Well, that's exactly it. You have to know where to draw the line, and the line is anything that is negative in the eyes of the trademark copyright holder. And it's their decision all the way. When I did a story about the pulp hero, the Spider.
Yes.
I was told that his manservant could not be referred to as a Sikh, although he was, and had been referred to that way frequently throughout the pulp stories. Why? I don't know. Perhaps current day and age saying that might be insensitive to a particular religious group. Didn't bother me in the least, because the story remained the story I wrote.
Well, the story you wrote. Now let's take this in another direction.
Sure.
Licensed versus your own thing. Your most passionate, the project that you're most passionate about, and your entire profile of writing and everything. What was that project, first off? And the second question is, what made it your favorite project? Like, why was it? Why did it hold so much meaning to you?
the one I'm working on anytime. When I'm in it, I'm not approaching it in a perfunctory manner. I want it to be something that yields the results that I'm seeking as an artist, as a storyteller, as a creator. And so when I was working on that Marilyn Monroe first serious story, I was talking about a story called I Am Your Need. That was it. Earlier, it was a story called, I believe I alluded to this, Buckeye Jim in Egypt, because I was really digging the research that went into it, the understanding of Southern Illinois folklore. That was it. I'm sure that when I'm neck deep in the current project, which brings Marilyn Monroe to Cuba, where she and Ernest Hemingway have decided to form an independent film production company to film his story, The Killers. And she stars as his originally male hero, Nick Adams. She becomes Nikki Adams. That'll be the heavy-duty, all-consuming project, and I hope it comes out as good as I'm hoping to make it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had I had a writer come on the show last Wednesday, and he worked on the book called The Führer and the Tramp, which was basically about Charlie Chaplin and the process of making The Great Dictator, and taking a fictional kind of run at it. And it's interweaving the actual history. There's a lot of research that goes into what you're doing here, and a lot of appreciation for the person themselves. What about Marilyn Monroe and Ernest Hemingway really speak to you? And how did you kind of like build this this focal point for your story?
Two tragic people who could have ended better had fate been a little more kind. There's no stretch of the imagination that she greatly admired Ernest Hemingway. She greatly admired writers. No stretch of the imagination that he spent much of his life hoping to someday have a daughter. Now, this is talking to me immediately. Here's somebody Marilyn Monroe, who goes around looking for father images her entire life. And here is Ernest Hemingway called Papa, who wants a daughter and has, ready for this, has a thing for blondes, which he did. So all the factors were there, and it's like I'm passing the burning bush and saying, Mort, here's your story, and I think I've got it. So
I absolutely think you do. I mean, because it's just like it's romantic, but it's also so sad, because it's a what could have been. But yeah, it's also an optimistic thing, because what if we did get those two creators together? That this fine actress and this incredible writer, what if they did collaborate? What if they did do these things? Because it could have happened if they were just, all it would have taken was one to reach the other, or for them to just be thrown into a room at the same time. It could have easily happened.
Oh yeah, and like I said, Marilyn Monroe had a thing about writers. She loved the poetry of Carl Sandburg, and spent one afternoon with Sandburg showing her all kinds of guitar chords, because she played a little bit and he played fairly well. And it was always a writer driven. She just dug all kinds of writers, and of course she married Arthur Miller for a very brief time.
And what's interesting too is that there's a marriage of music and writing, which
I know exactly.
Of course, and that's how you bring yourself into this, I would think, from the way I'm seeing it, because your career is a marriage of music and writing.
Yeah, and believe me, as I'm doing some of these scenes, mapping them out, I'm hearing a soundtrack for them as well.
That's incredible. And do you ever stop? What's your writing process like? Are you just literally sitting there in front of the typewriter banging stuff out while smoking a cigar, or do you take breaks? Do you play music in between? Do you?
Yes, except when I don't. If I'm really into something, not so much these days, because when you need a chiropractor as your consultant, you don't sit in the chair for 12 hours at a shot.
Yes.
But yeah, if I really have a scene that's going well, then I'll be walking around, I'll be acting out the scene. I may flip on some music that hits me as right, or I may play some that's, oh yeah, that's right, that's it, and that's, oh, we want to keep that cadence. They all tie together. There's not one art that exists in isolation from any other art.
That's incredible. Okay, so Zen, you mentioned that before.
Mm-hmm.
Take me to your place of Zen. You're like, if you had tonight's going to be a creative night for you, where you get to, everything, like, everything is, the stars are aligned, you're about to sit down and have a really creative night. How does that creative night look? What's going on in the background? What are you looking at? How are you feeling? How's it all coming together?
It's one of those moments where it's totally natural to the point where I'm quoting Dishamaru, who says, "The geese fly over the pond. They do not seek to cast their reflection." And when I've got that feeling right, I mean, and it doesn't happen often, but when it's right, I know that what's going on the page is what belongs on the page.
Yeah, because you can't just iron shit out. It's not like you can just sit in front of your, computer and type up like 4 pages of stuff and say, okay, I'm done. You have to constantly go back, look at what you're doing, just like what you did with the Batman novella. You had a chance to make it more words, but you cut it down because you saw fat there and you trimmed it.
Right.
But, this is you're practicing a craft, and you have to be in that Zen-like mode in order to, let things kind of let the story tell itself.
Yeah, and it comes from practice. I'm no golfer, but I had a golf experience way back when it's, oh my, that was the real drive. And golfers will know what I mean when I say you feel it from the ball, through the club, through yourself, and then you go half crazy for the next 6 weeks trying to, now, how was I standing exactly? No, hold on, the grip was like this. Oh, hold on, the sun was over my left shoulder then. Hold on, was I wearing my hat?
Yes, it's like the actual creative process allows you to kind of create the structure. But after that, you're spending the next, few weeks, 6 weeks, like you're saying, building that structure up, perfecting everything, sending it down. You got the image in your head, but then it's not fully clear yet.
I'm quoting the poem by Merritt Clifton called Ted Williams on the Art of Hitting, and it goes, here's the whole poem. All you need, 10,000 at-bats, and then get up there and forget everything you learned.
And that was exactly, honestly, bringing it to YI SOON SHIN for just a second.
Sure.
Because I remember when I turned in my first script to you, and you tore me a new ass. I mean, you just totally ripped it apart.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah, and not because you were trying to be a dick. You were pointing out things that needed to be pointed out. Things that was the reason why I sought your wise tutelage, is because I wanted to know what I was doing wrong. I wanted to know how to make it right. And when you told me that I needed to focus on the thing I wanted to write about most pertaining to YI SOON SHIN, that's when I was able to lay down that groundwork. And when I sent you that first revised script, that second draft, or that first draft, I would say, because what you ripped apart was the rough draft. The first draft was there. I instantly saw a difference in your tone. You saw that I had taken what you said seriously, and you helped me hone it into what would eventually become Warrior and Defender #1. And what you described when you were saying about, things just natural, the analogy used about the pigeons, when you had mentioned that, that's kind of how I felt when I was going back to the drawing board, because it's not like you were just trying to break me down. You were breaking me down so that you could build me back up.
There you go. And that's what the teaching and that's what the learning is all about. And indeed, you approached it in a totally different way once we got some of the, once we took off your glasses and cleaned them up a bit, okay?
Yeah, absolutely. And have you always been the kind of writer that self-regulates that, or do you refer to, do you have trusted people that you go to consult? And like, let's say you write something, who's the first person who sees it? Is it your editor, or is it somebody you trust?
Me.
It's you.
Yeah, after all these years, it's me. The first 10 years, forget it. The first 10 years, first 10 years of being a serious writer, my high school classes could count on being my first readers. My fellow writers could count on being my first readers. And way back when I hit a bad period and couldn't sell novels at all, I sent the late Jerry Williamson 60 pages of a novel and said, Jerry, can you help me with this? Maybe there's a trick or two, because Jerry had 3 novels published already and a number of short stories. And Jerry took a look at my first 60 pages of the novel, said, well, it's more than a trick or two, because you're a respected pro, you've been at it a while, and I have to tell you, I've seldom seen a bigger bunch of garbage coming from a pro in my life. And then he typed, and this was the days when we still had, boys and girls, pay attention, we had them typewriter machines. The typewriter was his weapon of choice. He wrote me 10 single-spaced pages of problems in my story. And when I got done, suitably thanking him in my mind along the lines of, who do you think you are, you old bastard, you? I took a look at what he said. He wasn't right any more than 97 times out of 100. I made all the corrections he suggested. I finished the book. The book became The Strangers. The Strangers has not been out of print for the past 20 years. The Strangers is in development as a film in New Zealand right now. And
you've told me about this last time we saw each other in I think November. And how are things progressing with that right now, given what we're going through? Because I know New Zealand is one of the few countries that has managed to completely curb the to curb everything. I don't know why I'm losing words in my head today, but they flattened the curve. That's what they did.
Yes, they're in good shape
now. So have you seen any progress since then, or is it still kind of too early?
Right now, the producer, director, and his chief screenwriter, Gavin MacLeod, are both working on the script and hope to move ahead with the film itself just as soon as the world opens back up. As you probably know, New Zealand is becoming one of the world's centers for motion pictures. Certainly it ought to, with people like Peter Jackson being there and running a whole bunch of stuff. And a lot of things are happening in New Zealand. And the thing that I'm most happy about is that I'm going to mention by name, James Ashcroft, director, producer, who said he wants The Strangers and wants to set the story in New Zealand because it's territory he knows, but figures the story is universal enough that it's going to reach everybody. So that really has not been hurt terribly much at all. It's in development, and they have time to focus on the development.
That's fantastic. I'm so glad to hear that, because there are so many projects out there right now that are like, either canceled indefinitely, or, just, simply, put off.
Oh, yeah. And the world's going through a whole bunch of transition right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I have great faith that we'll come back stronger after this, because I think the need for entertainment, and especially right now with everybody being locked down, is more important than ever. And while we're on that topic, what is inspiring you right now? Like, what are you reading? What are you watching? What are you passing?
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I haven't been able to sit and read like this for years. So I'm going through the entire collection of the Philip Carr series of Bernie Gunther mystery novels. They're all set during the period of the Weimar Republic right up through the 1950s in Germany, with a private detective character, Bernie Gunther, taking on various crimes during the Nazi era. Fascinating, beautifully researched, beautifully told, remind me so much of Graham Greene stuff. We're living in a golden age for television as well. I mean, Ozarks, The Plot Against America, absolutely brilliant. Anybody who says I can't find anything to watch hasn't bothered to turn on the television.
Oh, I agree. There is something out there for and I feel the same is true about comics right now, because we've always seen comics as being this one-minded thing, like it's superheroes and that's it. But now, the industry has opened up tremendously, and you got all kinds of different stories, not only being introduced but adapted as well. But I want to go back to editing for just
Sure.
a second. So your self-editing thing, I forgot. I trailed off, but I wanted to come back to it. So when you say that you self-edit now, do you still hear the voices in your head of, or see all those criticisms in yourself and address that? Do you hear those, like, I guess?
Yes, and yes. Anything I've been telling a student about, hold on a second, do you need that paragraph? Well, can you get away with a sentence instead? Hold on, do you need that sentence? Can you get away with a phrase instead? Hold on, do you need the phrase? Maybe you can do it with just a word. Hold on, do you need the word? And when I'm absolutely sure that every word on the page is a needed word, then I know that part of the editing is done. And this is a direct steal from the hero, Hemingway. Cut, cut, cut is the prime rule of editing.
And that's what you had me do. You had me trim all the fat, especially in comics. There is no room for fat in comics.
Exactly.
You got to get right to the story.
I've often said that Hemingway would have made a great comics writer. He didn't waste a word. He gave you what was going on. He gave you people talking in really sharp ping-pong dialogue, and that would have been made for comics totally. His stuff plays real well on radio. It's played real well on radio, and comic books would have been the same thing.
If only, right? It's sort of like what you're doing with your story with bringing Marilyn Monroe and Hemingway together. What if he met Stan Lee and they got, well, not Stan Lee, it could have been any comics publisher, it could have been Martin Goodman, and
you bet
he could have been the Stan Lee that comics that never knew.
Indeed.
That's interesting from from a creative, to see the world in that light. And you certainly can do that. There is one last thing I want to talk to you about, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Sure.
So one of your books that's being released by Clover Press this year, hopefully, I hope to see it re-released. It's a book you've written before, Deadly Elections. And it has a lot of similarities to what's going on. You've mentioned that it has a lot of similarities to what's going on in our current political climate. And without getting too politically, charged in one direction or the other, this is a thriller, and it's something that is very real and something that I think is very pertinent to these very strange and interesting times we live in.
Strange and interesting. Good words. Exactly chosen words. You bet. The book originally came out in 1977. Which
was also kind of like politically, like the climate was pretty rough then too, right?
Oh yeah. And how does a man get himself elected? By putting on we've got to be tough on crime. We've got to have a strong figure. And it was a parody in a lot of ways, but it was also an action-adventure thriller. Unfortunately, the first time it was released, the distribution was so terrible that even though it had just scored a full-page article in the Chicago Sun-Times, the day that came out, that book was on sale in 2 Chicago area bookstores.
How did that happen?
a real long story involving tax write-off, money laundering, and distributors in league with certain underground people who wanted to have a tax write-off.
And you've told me situations like this before. You've prepared me for all the worst.
Oh, yeah.
And also in a lot of ways taught me how to approach this business in general. And I mean, again, you have literally been through it and seen it all. I've heard many stories, and these stories would be enough to crush anyone who is faint of heart, thinking that working in this business is all a pipe dream.
Which is, of course, all the better for us because it keeps the ranks of our competition thinned out.
Yes, it does, absolutely. And I can't imagine how much that when these things first happen. It's like you wrote this book and it's got shit distribution. How did that make you feel? Were you just like, all right, fuck this, I'm moving on to the next thing?
Of course. And this is the ticket. The analogy I use is the old bread on the waters, okay? You toss the bread out on the water. It's the best bread you can bake, period. And sometimes all you've done is provide a really nice buffet for the fish. Other times, the waves bring back soggy bread. But then, sometimes too, out of nowhere, the cosmic dice roll in your favor, and you get Fig Newtons coming back to you. Here is the deadly election coming out in 2020 after first not doing all that much in 1977. Here is The Strangers, first coming out in 1984. Didn't do terribly, but it broke even. But the next thing you know, it's reprinted in Poland in 2008. It becomes one of the 10 best books in the thriller category published in Poland, according to Newsweek magazine. Then we have a New Zealand film producer saying, I want this book. So you do your work, you put together a body of work, and then time, tide, cosmic dice, bread on the waters, let's see what happens. The only thing you can control is, hold on, this bread isn't any good. I'm not going to throw this out onto the water. If it's no good, make it good. Work it over again.
You have years of experience behind you, but you're just getting started. I can hear it in your voice.
Hey, like I said, another 30 years, I'm going to have it knocked.
Absolutely. I have no doubt about that. Mort, our time is coming to a close. Could you do us a favor? Tell us where we can find you, and then do that other thing you promised me you do. Play on the harmonica for us.
I'm all over the place, but you can definitely find me on Facebook, which is the easiest, just by name. You can find me teaching come autumn and school back in session, we hope. I'll be teaching a class in why it's comics creating. Won't that be neat? And as far as the other thing you mentioned, well, it's been a pleasure being with you, buddy.
Bravo. Thank you so much, Mort. Thank you again. Stick on backstage. I'll be right there, okay?
Deal.
Okay, great. What an episode. Now you know why I picked Mort as my mentor, or can I say he picked me? There's that saying that when the student is ready, the master will appear. And Mort has always had my side, and you can see why. His energy, his go-getter attitude is what has always driven me to want to learn from him. And the fact that he's not just throwing stuff out there. He's not throwing darts at the dartboard. He is really thinking about what he is putting out there. He's really focused on the actual content itself. And he really worked me up in order to get YI SOON SHIN to where it is. And it was a tremendous pleasure to be able to sit down with him and really talk to him about things that I probably never would have gotten around to doing if we weren't in this situation. So as we're kind of coming out of this pandemic slowly, as we're just kind of like poking our noses out, still very cautious of everything that's going on out there, take this time and talk to the people that, you know, are around you. Learn from them, as I am learning from all of my contemporaries, because once the engine is rolling again, there will be no time for that, because we will have to make up for lost time. And all the things that I am learning from, even, you know, all my contemporaries, as well as my mentors will always keep teaching you new things if you come to them, because they have that experience. And Mort is doing it. He's not just some guy who's sitting in the back seat saying, you know, when's my time going to come? He was always at the forefront. All right, folks, tomorrow we got another great episode, and we're going to wrap up this week. And then we got another great week, and it's just going to keep going. The fun is just getting started. I'll see you then. Onward to victory.